You come to me this evening, some of you wearied by the weight of thought, the fever of a mind that turns upon itself in endless revolutions. I sense the tension within you, a tightening, like a spring that cannot find release. Perhaps you have noticed in quiet hours or sleepless nights the peculiar agony of a mind that, instead of liberating you, becomes your most cunning jailer. You have trusted in your mind as one trusts a loyal guide, and yet at certain thresholds you have discovered that this companion so clever, so intricate, has the power to turn back upon you and devour its own foundation. Why do the most gifted thinkers, those who pride themselves on their intelligence, sometimes become the very victims of that power? Let us take a slow walk together through the corridors of psyche and, if you will, follow me into the deeper shadows, where the mind, so proud and so vulnerable, reveals its double nature. You see, there is an ancient paradox at the heart of our condition as thinking beings from the earliest days. Myth has warned us of the dangers of the intellect unmoored from the depths. Prometheus, who stole fire intellect. Consciousness, the divine spark, was chained and tormented for his hubris. Icarus, intoxicated by the notion of flight, soared too close to the sun and fell. These are not merely stories for children. They are living dramas enacted within each of us. The overthinker is, in a sense, a modern Prometheus, one who dares to wield the torch of analysis, but who risks being consumed by the very light he has stolen from the gods. What is it that draws us into the labyrinth of thought? I ask you, not as a philosopher removed from life, but as one who has wandered those winding paths myself. There is a peculiar seduction in the act of thinking, a sense of mastery and order, a delight in unraveling the knots of existence. The mind, like a skilled craftsman, weaves narratives, solves riddles, finds connections where none were visible. Yet, like all archetypal energies, the intellect has its shadow, for the mind is not the whole of the psyche, it is but a portion, and when it grows arrogant, when it begins to believe itself the master of all, it falls prey to a sickness I have called inflation. Inflation is the expansion of the conscious mind at the expense of the unconscious, a swelling that distorts perspective. It is the overthinker's curse to believe that if only one could think enough, analyze deeply enough, the world would yield its secrets, suffering would vanish, and control would be restored. But the psyche, like nature, abhors imbalance. That which rises too high is always in danger of a fall. Imagine, if you will, a dream. You stand before a vast, dark forest at dusk. The trees press in, ancient and silent. You feel an urge to enter, but your mind resists. It is too dark, too dangerous. It warns. Yet you sense that somewhere within lies a truth or treasure essential to your being. This is the drama of the overthinker, the call to enter the unconscious, the refusal to trust anything that cannot be reasoned, the paralysis before the unknown. The forest is alive with symbol and instinct, with memory and longing, with shadows and ancestors whose voices murmur at the edge of hearing. The overthinker, ruled by the tyrant of reason, stands at the threshold but cannot cross, spinning endless arguments at the forest's edge. But the unconscious is not so easily banished. What we reject, repress, or deny in ourselves does not disappear. It slips beneath the surface, becoming shadow, growing in power and resentment, awaiting its hour. The more fiercely we cling to our thoughts, the more we suppress those mysterious currents that give life depth and meaning. The overthinker, seeking safety in analysis, unwittingly feeds the very forces that will one day overwhelm him. Let us go deeper still. What is the origin of this compulsion to think, to analyze, to control through intellect? Is it not at root a defense against the chaos of emotion, of instinct, of the vast unknown that lives both in the world and within us? The overthinker stands guard at the gate, hoping to bar entry to the wild, irrational, dangerous elements of the psyche. But what is repressed becomes fate. The more rigidly we cling to thought, the more surely we are haunted by what we refuse to see. Neurosis, in many of its forms, is the result of this imbalanced mind at war with the body, reason at war with feeling, consciousness at war with the unconscious. In my own work with patients, I have seen again and again how those most celebrated for their intellect are sometimes the most tormented. The lawyer, the scientist, the philosopher, so skilled in the play of ideas, can find themselves brought low by an inexplicable dread, a nameless anxiety, a sense of hollowness that no amount of thinking can dispel. The mind, trusted for so long as the source of salvation, becomes instead a labyrinth with no exit, a hall of mirrors in which the self is fractured and lost. I am reminded of the old tale of Narcissus, who gazed into the pool and fell in love with his own image, failing to recognize its emptiness, its inability to answer his longing. The overthinker is a kind of Narcissus, entranced by the mind's reflection, mistaking it for the fullness of life. But the image is not the reality, the map is not the territory. The intellect, no matter how sharp, cannot replace the living waters of the unconscious. Consider for a moment the archetype of the trickster, that ancient figure who appears across cultures, a being of paradox, both creator and destroyer, guide and deceiver. The trickster embodies the aspect of psyche that disrupts order, overturns the tyranny of reason, and restores the balance of opposites when the mind becomes too rigid, too sure of its dominion. The trickster arrives perhaps in dreams, perhaps in accidents, perhaps in the sudden onset of anxiety or depression, to remind us that life is more than thought. To be destroyed by the mind one trusts is in a sense, to be visited by the trickster who forces a descent into shadow so that something new may be born. You may feel at times that your overthinking is a sign of failure, of inadequacy, of being unequal to life's demands, but I tell you, it is rather a symptom of an inner imbalance, a call to adventure, a summons to descend from the heights of reason into the fertile darkness below. The psyche is like a great tree, its branches reaching for the heavens, but its roots sunk deep in the earth. To live in the branches alone is to invite disaster. Sooner or later, the storms will come, and without roots, you will be swept away. In my own descent into the unconscious those years, I have sometimes called my confrontation with the unconscious. I experienced the terror and wonder of leaving the safe harbor of intellect. Dreams grew strange. Voices spoke from within. Images arose that defied all logic. I learned, not without struggle, that the mind must serve, the whole psyche, not dominate it. Thought is a tool, not a tyrant, a servant, not a master. If you sense within yourself the beginnings of destruction, the anxiety that will not be calmed, the compulsive turning of thought, the inability to act or decide, do not despair. The wound is also the opening. The breakdown of the old order is the beginning of something new. Overthinking is not at its heart a flaw to be eradicated, but a signal that a new relationship with the psyche is required. The path is not to reject the mind, but to invite the unconscious to the table, to honor instinct, feeling, symbol, and dream. Let me ask you to reflect on your own dreams. Have you noticed how, in the world of dreams, the laws of logic are suspended and the strangest symbols arise? The dream speaks in a language older than words, a language of images and effects, of transformations and paradox. The overthinker is often terrified of this world, fearing that to surrender control is to be lost forever. But the dream is the bridge to the unconscious, the royal road, as Freud called it, though he did not follow it as far as I wished. In dreams, the overthinker is confronted with the very energies he has sought to avoid. A dream may show a house with locked doors, a forest full of unseen eyes, a child crying in the darkness. These are not enemies, but guides, parts of yourself exiled by the mind, now seeking reintegration. And what of the shadow, that most troublesome companion? The overthinker, in his zeal to maintain order, often banishes all that is unruly, passionate, irrational, only to find these elements returning with redoubled force. The shadow grows in power as it is denied, until, in moments of stress or exhaustion, it erupts with volcanic intensity. Anger, envy, despair, compulsions. These are often the voice of the shadow, demanding recognition. To be destroyed by the mind is, at bottom, to be destroyed by the shadow. Denied, there is within each of us an archetype I call the self, the organizing principle of the psyche, the center and circumference, the source of meaning and wholeness. The mind is but one aspect of the self, not the totality. When the mind grows proud and isolates itself, the self responds by sending dreams, symptoms, synchronicities, calls to reunite what has been sundered. The task of individuation, the central drama of a human life, is to bring all parts of the psyche into harmonious relationship, not to abolish thought, but to seat it at the round table with instinct, feeling, intuition, and sensation. I have spoken of symbols, for it is through symbol that the unconscious communicates with the conscious mind. The overthinker, in his quest for certainty, often rejects the ambiguous, the poetic, the irrational. Yet it is precisely in the symbol that the possibility of transformation resides. A serpent shedding its skin, a lion sleeping beside a lamb, a river winding through a barren land. These are not merely images, but invitations to a new relationship with life. The mind, when it becomes too narrow, too literal, too insistent on explanation, loses contact with the source of its own vitality. I invite you now, as we move deeper into this exploration, to consider that your mind, so trusted, so beloved, may not always have your best interests at heart. The mind can become possessed by an archetype, inflated by a complex, driven by unconscious fears. Overthinking is often the mind's attempt to avoid feeling, to stave off chaos, to build walls against the unknown. But life cannot be contained within such walls. Sooner or later, the sea will break through. The way forward is not to abandon thinking, but to open to the fullness of your being, to listen to dreams, to honor feelings, to welcome the shadow, to live with the paradox and ambiguity that mark the depths of the psyche. In the next stage of our journey, we shall follow these threads further, examining how overthinking traps us in the web of neurosis, how the archetypes play through us, how the soul yearns for a deeper truth than thought alone can provide. Let us rest here for a moment in the tension between mind and soul. Feel, if you can, the stirrings of the unconscious within you. You are not alone in your struggle. You are part of a story as old as humanity itself. And if you are willing to walk with me into the unknown, we may find together the door that leads from destruction to wholeness. If you will allow yourself to linger a while longer in this liminal space between the tyranny of the rational mind and the murmurings of the deeper self, you may begin to notice a subtle movement within. It is not always dramatic, nor does it come with thunder and revelation. Sometimes it is only a vague unease, the sense that something essential is missing, that beneath all the explanations and calculations, there is a hollowness, a thirst for meaning that thought alone cannot quench. It is here, in this fertile void, that the journey truly begins. Why do we come to trust the mind so much? For most of us, the world has rewarded the faculties of intellect and reason from an early age, our cultures, especially in the West, elevate the rational, the measurable, the explainable above all else. We learn to solve, to dissect, to predict. We are taught that the world is a puzzle to be unraveled, a machine to be understood and ultimately mastered. This inheritance is not evil in itself. Indeed, it is the source of civilization's great achievements. But what is gained on the surface is often lost in the depths. The overthinker, celebrated for sharpness and insight, becomes cut off from the archaic wellspring that nourishes the soul. I have often seen in the lives of those who suffer from the excesses of intellect a kind of exile. They become strangers to their own feeling life, outcasts from the garden of instinct and symbol. They dwell in tall towers of abstraction, windows gleaming with the light of logic, but the ground beneath them grows ever more remote. They sense in fleeting moments, perhaps at night, when thoughts grow unmoored and the heart beats against the bars of its cage, that something vital is slipping away. It is as if they have made a pact with a trickster spirit, trading their birthright of wholeness for the glittering coins of certainty and control. But the psyche, as I have said, is not a mere servant of consciousness. It is a vast living landscape, and the unconscious cannot be banished by decree. The very mechanisms that make the intellect powerful analysis, division, categorization, become weapons turned inward, splintering the self and generating inner conflict. The overthinker, instead of bringing order to chaos, often multiplies confusion, spinning ever more elaborate webs of doubt and second-guessing. Action becomes impossible. Choices dissolve into 1,000 possibilities, each weighed and measured, but never chosen. Here, the archetype of the hero falters, for he is caught in a battle not with outer dragons, but with the hydra of his own mind. Each head he severs gives rise to two more. The intellect, rather than freeing him, binds him in ever-tightening coils. The ego, desperate for mastery, finds itself trapped in the very labyrinth it has constructed. The suffering that results is profound, not only anxiety, but a sense of unreality, a gnawing suspicion that life is passing by while one stands motionless at the crossroads. Let me draw upon a dream that may not be yours, yet belongs to all of us. In it, a man walks through an endless library, shelves rising so high they disappear into mist. He clutches a lantern, searching for a single book, the book of answers whose pages will grant him certainty and peace. Yet every time he opens a volume, the words swirl and vanish, or the text is written in an unknown tongue. At last, exhausted, he slumps to the floor. It is then that a child appears, wordless, barefoot, bearing a single flower plucked from the wild fields outside. The child offers the flower, and the man weeps, realizing he has forgotten what the books cannot teach. The lived, felt experience of being alive, this is no idle fancy. The overthinker is, in a sense, forever lost in that library, searching for security in knowledge, mistaking the map for the territory. Yet the unconscious will not be silenced by logic. It speaks through dreams, through somatic symptoms, through sudden moods and irrational impulses. The body itself becomes the stage for unresolved psychic conflicts, headaches, insomnia, digestive troubles, fatigue. These may all be the language of the soul asking to be heard, where words have failed. In analysis, I have witnessed how, as soon as one dares to listen to the body, to the forgotten emotions, to the illogical signals from within, a shift begins. The grip of obsessive thought loosens, and images arise from the depths. A stormy sea, a broken bridge, a wounded animal, a mother's embrace withheld. Each image, each feeling is a cipher, a key to a part of oneself that the mind had declared unimportant or dangerous. The work of healing is not to destroy the mind, but to teach it humility, to persuade it to listen as well as to speak. There is a pattern to, in the overthinkers' relationships, intellect may become a shield, a way of defending against intimacy, uncertainty, and the risk of vulnerability. The mind is deployed to analyze, predict, and protect, but in so doing, it erects walls. Love, friendship, even simple connection become fraught, for every gesture is scrutinized, every word dissected. The beloved becomes an object of study rather than a mystery to be encountered. Thus, overthinking is often a flight from the other, an avoidance of the pain and joy of true meeting. The mind promises safety, but delivers loneliness. And yet, I do not wish to condemn the mind. It is not our enemy. The power to think, to reason, to question, these are the gifts of spirit, the mark of human dignity. What I urge is not their abolition, but their integration. The mind must be brought back into dialogue with the heart, with the instincts, with the dark and fertile ground of the unconscious. Only then can it become what it was meant to be, a light by which we navigate the mystery, not a prison that blinds us to it. Symbol and story, as I have said, are the languages of the unconscious. The overthinker, anxious for clarity, often recoils from the ambiguity of myth and metaphor, but it is precisely through these living images that the psyche renews itself to dream of water, of journeying through night, of losing and finding, of dying and being reborn. These are not random firings of a mechanistic brain, but messages from the depths, invitations to descend and rise anew. The task is to learn to read the signs, to allow the wisdom of symbol to temper the tyranny of the literal. Let us turn for a moment to the shadow, for it plays a vital role in the drama of overthinking. The shadow is not merely the sum of our bad qualities, but the unlived life, the unloved child, the energies repressed or ignored because they did not fit the conscious ideal. For the overthinker, The shadow often contains spontaneity, play, instinct, even folly, the very qualities most feared and most needed. When these are banished, life becomes gray, sterile, haunted by what-ifs and if-onlys. The shadow, denied and demonized, takes its revenge in sudden outbursts, in sabotaged plans, in compulsions and addictions that seem to spring from nowhere. The mind, seeking to control all, discovers itself at the mercy of the very forces it rejected. Yet, it is in the meeting with the shadow that transformation becomes possible. I have seen it in countless analytic journeys. A patient, paralyzed by overthinking, finally dares to feel the anger, the grief, the wild joy long suppressed. The energy trapped in obsessive thought is released, flowing into action, into art, into authentic relationship. The mind, relieved of its lonely burden, learns to trust the larger self, to participate in the dance of opposites. Here, in the crucible of suffering, the possibility of wholeness is born, but beware, the process is not linear, nor can it be forced. The mind, habituated to control, will seek to turn even this into a program, a new scheme for self-improvement. The unconscious resists such efforts. It moves in its own time, by its own logic, often in spirals rather than straight lines. The path is not to dominate, but to listen, not to impose, but to welcome, not to explain, but to experience, to sit, at times, in unknowing, allowing the wisdom of the body, the symbol, the dream, to work its slow alchemy. Perhaps you will recognize this in your own life. Have you not felt the exhaustion that follows a day spent wrestling with insoluble questions? The sense of being cut off from the world and from yourself, and yet, have you not also tasted the freedom that comes in moments when thought ceases? When you are swept up by music, by beauty, by the laughter of a friend, by the mystery of a starry sky, these are not mere distractions, but reminders of a deeper truth, that life is lived not in the mind alone, but in the whole of the being. The task is to allow thought its place, but not to grant it the throne. In the myths of old, the hero is often aided by humble helpers, animals, strangers, mysterious guides who offer gifts. The hero cannot win by force. So it is with the overthinker. The path to healing often comes through what was once despised or ignored. The spontaneous laugh, the foolish mistake, the sudden tear. These may be the messengers of the self, the reminders that the way forward is not always the way of reason. To trust the mind is human. To be destroyed by it is a tragedy. But to reconcile the mind with the soul, to allow each its voice in the great symphony of the self, that is the work of individuation, the goal toward which all true healing moves. The journey is not without pain, nor is it ever complete, but each step toward wholeness brings a deeper joy, a more abiding peace, a sense that one is at home in the world and in oneself. Let us pause again, not at the end, but at another threshold. The journey continues, and there is more to be said, more to be discovered. If you have followed me thus far, you are already walking the path, not the path of overthinking, but the path of awakening to the fullness of your own being. When we journey onward, deeper still into the valley of psyche, we encounter the terrain where thought, shadow, and soul entwine in ever more intricate dances. The path is neither straight nor predictable. Sometimes it winds backward or doubles upon itself, much like a dream whose meanings are never quite what they seem. And I ask you to notice, as you listen to my words, how often your mind seeks to categorize, to summarize, to grasp for certainty, as if meaning itself were an object to be seized, rather than an experience to be lived. This, too, is a signature of overthinking, a kind of anxious grasping, a yearning for finality in a world made of ambiguity and transformation. Let us linger upon the archetype of the labyrinth, a symbol both ancient and living, found in myth, in temple stones, and, most powerfully, in the unconscious itself. The labyrinth is not a maze built to confound, but a journey inward, a path that leads us to the center, to the encounter with what is most real and most mysterious within. The overthinker is often ensnared in the outer coils, circling endlessly, afraid to enter the heart, where thought must give way to experience, where the minotaur of the shadow awaits. And yet, to refuse this descent is to remain forever a stranger to oneself, living in a palace of mirrors, a self-constructed exile. There is a suffering that comes from the refusal to descend, the suffering of restlessness, of never arriving, of knowing many things but embodying none. The overthinker can recite 1,000 truths and yet feel none of them. The psyche grows parched, the colors of the world dim, life becomes abstract and spectral, as if one were living always at a distance. The living center, the heart of the labyrinth, calls out through symptoms, through the longing for something more, through the sense that, despite all the thinking, one remains unfulfilled. I have witnessed in the consulting room and in the mirror of my own soul how the refusal of this journey breeds a quiet despair. Action becomes impossible, not for lack of intelligence, but for excess of caution and doubt. The will is sapped by an endless weighing of options, a paralysis of analysis. This is the landscape of neurosis, where thought is turned inward like a serpent biting its own tail, producing not clarity, but confusion, exhaustion, and regret. But let us not demonize the mind or the act of thinking. Every archetype, every psychic power contains both light and shadow. The mind is Promethean. It brings fire, language, and reflection. Without it, there would be no science, no art, no civilization. Yet, when the mind grows isolated, when it forgets its place in the greater whole, it falls prey to hubris. It loses its relationship to the body, to instinct, to the deep and wordless wisdom that rises from the unconscious. Thus, the task is not to destroy the mind, but to redeem it, to reintegrate it with the fullness of the self. Here we meet another powerful archetype, the wise old man or woman, the inner sage who appears in dreams and stories to offer guidance at moments of crisis. The sage does not denounce thought, but tempers it with humility and compassion. The sage is the mediator between worlds, able to hold paradox, to see beyond opposites, to recognize that the greatest truths are often those that cannot be spoken, only lived. The overthinker, if he or she is to be saved from destruction, must learn to listen for this inner sage, to allow wisdom to emerge from the meeting of conscious and unconscious. Reason and intuition, often this means accepting the limits of knowledge. There is a great relief, a deep peace that arises when we admit, I do not know, to surrender to mystery, to allow questions to remain open, to let go of the compulsion for closure. This is not weakness, but strength. It is the beginning of wisdom. The mind, humbled, becomes again the servant of life, not its jailer. There is a passage in the Tao Te Ching, to know that you do not know is the beginning. The overthinker, for all his efforts, must one day discover the grace of not knowing. Let me share another dream. As dreams are the soil from which the symbols of transformation grow, in this dream, a woman wanders through a great city at night. The streets are full of voices, but she cannot understand the language. She is searching for a house she remembers from childhood, a place where she once felt safe. She turns down alleyways, climbs endless staircases, knocks on doors, but no one answers. At last, in a forgotten courtyard, she finds a small fountain, its water illuminated by moonlight. She sits beside it and begins to weep. As she does, a sense of warmth, of presence, fills her, and though she is still lost, she is no longer alone. The overthinker, too, is often lost in the city of the mind, searching for a home that cannot be found in facts or theories. It is only when we allow ourselves to feel, to grieve, to be vulnerable, that the fountain of the unconscious begins to flow again, that healing and guidance become possible. The dream reminds us that answers are not always what we need. Sometimes it is the experience of being held, of being witnessed by another or by the larger self that restores us to wholeness. I would ask you now to reflect on the moments in your own life when thinking failed you, not because you were foolish or unprepared, but because the situation required something beyond analysis, a leap of faith, a surrender to feeling, an act of forgiveness, or an embrace of the unknown. These are not the territory of the mind alone. They are the gifts of the soul, the acts that restore meaning to a life otherwise burdened by too much thought. And what of the creative impulse, that mystery at the heart of all true transformation? Creativity does not emerge from calculation or control. It springs from the union of opposites, from the marriage of order and chaos, of conscious and unconscious, the artist, the poet, the mystic, all know that inspiration comes not when the mind is straining, but when it is open, receptive, humble before the unknown. The overthinker, desperate for certainty, often strangles this impulse, fearing the loss of control. Yet it is precisely in letting go, in risking error, in daring to be foolish, that creativity blossoms in my own life. The years when I surrendered to the visions and images that arose from within those confrontations with the unconscious were the most fertile and terrifying. I learned to trust what I could not explain, to record the images, to follow the dreams, to allow the irrational its place in my work and in my soul. It was not always pleasant. At times it felt like madness, but out of that darkness came a new integration, a sense of being carried by something greater than myself. The mind was not abolished, but transfigured, made luminous by its contact with the depths. The danger for the overthinker is always the same: to confuse the voice of fear for the voice of reason, to mistake anxiety for prudence, to treat the urgings of the shadow as threats to be eradicated rather than invitations to grow. The journey toward wholeness is not a flight from the mind, but a descent through it into the soil of the unconscious, where the seeds of new life await. Let us remember, too, that the collective unconscious is at work in us all. Our personal struggles with overthinking are shaped by the myths, the wounds, the histories of our families and cultures. Sometimes we are haunted by questions that do not belong to us alone, but are echoes of ancestral dilemmas. The unfinished business of generations, to heal, to individuate, is to take up these burdens, to honor them, and, where possible, to transform them, not by analysis alone, but by living the questions, by daring to enter the labyrinth and face whatever dwells at its heart. At this point, you may sense a resistance within a part of you that wants to retreat to the safety of thought, to dismiss all this talk of dream and symbol as romantic nonsense. This is understandable. The mind resists the loss of control. It fears annihilation. But I urge you to stay, to listen, to allow the discomfort, for it is often at the point of greatest resistance that the possibility of transformation is nearest. Do not be afraid of being lost. Do not fear the not knowing. The soul's journey is not one of straight lines, but of cycles, of seasons, of death and rebirth. What is most true is often hidden, not in the clarity of daylight, but in the fertile darkness, the night sea journey that every seeker must undertake. The mind will be needed along the way to interpret, to give form, to discern, but it cannot and must not be allowed to rule alone. The alchemists, those mystics of old, spoke of the opus, the great work of transformation. They sought to turn base matter into gold, but they understood at the deepest level that the true gold was the transfiguration of the soul. The overthinker's leaden, Heavy thoughts can, through suffering and surrender, become the gold of wisdom, of compassion, of creativity. But this requires patience, trust, and a willingness to be undone. So let us walk together a little further toward the unknown center. The mind is not your enemy, but it must learn its place as one voice among many. The journey is not about conquering thought, but about enlarging your sense of self until it can hold both thought and feeling, shadow and light, certainty and mystery. And when you feel yourself on the verge of being destroyed by the mind you have trusted, remember, the destruction is not an end, but a beginning out of the ruins of the old certainty. Something new, something more whole can be born when you approach the threshold of renewal after the mind has torn itself asunder in pursuit of certainty. There is a peculiar hush, a silence that is not emptiness, but potential. In this silence, something waits as if the very soul of the world is holding its breath. So often, we try to fill this space with more thought, more plans, more explanations, yet it is here, precisely in this pause, that the first stirrings of a deeper self may be felt, a self not born of analysis, but of encounter. Consider the archetype of the phoenix, that ancient bird who immolates itself upon its own pyre and rises again from the ashes, radiant and transformed. This image is not a mere ornament of myth, but a living process within the psyche. When the mind you trusted has become your undoing, and its cleverness leads only to despair, you may find yourself at the ashes of your former certainties. Here, if you do not flee, if you dare to remain, something new will begin, not as a sudden revelation, but as a gentle warmth, a flicker of intuition, a quiet confidence that has no need of explanation. The overthinker who has been brought low by the futility of endless analysis is uniquely poised for this rebirth. Stripped of the arrogance of knowing, you become porous to mystery. The psyche, ever seeking wholeness, offers unexpected gifts in this surrender, a dream that clarifies what waking thought could never resolve, a bodily sensation that points to truth, a spontaneous image, perhaps a symbol or a color or a word, rising unbidden from the depths. These are the signals of the unconscious answering not to reason, but to resonance. To the mind, such messages may seem irrelevant, but to the soul, they are precious threads guiding one out of the labyrinth. It is no accident that so many spiritual traditions speak of surrender, of letting go, of the death of the old self before the emergence of the new. For the overthinker, this surrender is not capitulation, but the dawning of wisdom. It is a descent from the head to the heart, from abstraction to embodiment. The mind, chastened by its failure, learns to listen. In that listening, you hear not only the whispers of your own depths, but the voices of those who have walked before you, the ancestors, the sages, the hidden guides whose wisdom has survived the ravages of time, the integration of mind and soul, of conscious and unconscious, is not a once-for-all event. It is a movement, a rhythm, a spiral. Sometimes the old patterns return, the urge to analyze, the compulsion to solve, the anxiety that seeks comfort in certainty. Do not despise these moments, nor imagine that you have failed. They are reminders that the journey is alive, that every advance into wholeness must be won again and again in the dance of opposites. As the alchemist said, solve, it coagula, dissolve, and bind. We must break down what is rigid and then gather what is living into new form. It is helpful in these passages to cultivate practices that invite the unconscious to speak. Dreams, as I have described, are one such royal road, but so too are images and symbols, spontaneous drawings or words, even the moods and synchronicities that color your days. When you feel yourself falling once again into the trap of overthinking, pause and ask, what is moving in me now that cannot be named? What image, memory, or feeling is seeking expression beneath the surface? Sometimes it is enough to sit with these questions, to wait, as one waits by the side of a deep pool for the first ripple to break the mirror of the water. I have seen again and again how creative activity becomes a vessel for this dialogue between mind and soul. Not creativity in the sense of artistic achievement, but the simple willingness to engage with life in a new way, to garden, to write, to build, to sing, to move one's body in rhythm with inner tides. These acts bypass the tyrant of the mind, inviting a direct participation in the mystery of being. They do not abolish thought, but restore it to its rightful place within the chorus of the psyche. At the same time, we must not neglect the body, for it is the oldest part of the psyche, the living ground in which all thoughts are rooted. The overthinker often floats above the world, a ghost in his own skin, afraid to feel the rawness of pain or the sweetness of pleasure. Yet the body is wise. It remembers what the mind has forgotten. It suffers when we neglect it, but it also rejoices when we return. In moments of anxiety, of mental exhaustion, I invite you to breathe, to feel your feet upon the earth, to allow sensation to anchor you in the present. The unconscious speaks through the body as surely as through dreams. In the process of healing, one inevitably encounters fear, the fear of losing control, the fear of failure, the fear of what lies beneath the surface. These are not obstacles to be conquered, but guides to be honored. Fear is the guardian at the threshold of transformation. The shadow's way of asking, are you willing to be changed? The mind will offer 1,000 reasons to turn back, to retreat into old patterns. But if you persist, if you remain open, the fear itself becomes a source of strength. What you were running from becomes what carries you forward. Let us remember that every journey inward is also a journey outward. As you heal the split between thought and feeling, You will find your relationships changing, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically, where once you analyzed the motives of others, now you may find yourself simply listening, allowing presence to do what words cannot. Where once you defended against vulnerability, now you may risk revealing your uncertainty, your longing, your wonder. This is not weakness, but courage. The willingness to be seen as you are, not as your mind would have you appear. The world to respond to these inner shifts. What was once flat and predictable becomes alive with meaning. Synchronicities, those uncanny coincidences that Jung himself named, begin to multiply. As if the unconscious were arranging small dramas to remind you that you are part of a story greater than your own. The boundaries between self and world, between thought and life, become porous. You sense, perhaps for the first time, that you are at home, not because you understand everything, but because you belong to the whole. Here, in this wider participation, the mind is not destroyed, but renewed. It is given a new task, not to control, but to serve, not to command, but to inquire, not to isolate, but to connect. The greatest minds I have found are those who remain humble before the mystery, who know when to think and when to dream, when to speak and when to listen. They are not untouched by suffering, but they are not undone by it. They have learned through pain and surrender that wholeness is found not in perfection, but in the willingness to be shaped by life. And so, I invite you to consider, what is the mind you trust? And what is the greater self that calls you beyond its limits? Where have you been destroyed by your own cleverness? And where have you been reborn through the gifts of unknowing? These are not questions to be answered once and for all, but to be lived, to be returned to, again and again, as the seasons of your life unfold. We are nearly at the edge of this evening's journey, and yet the work is never finished. Each day brings its own invitations, its own challenges, its own mysterious currents. The path of individuation is endless, a spiral that leads ever inward and outward, binding together the mind, the body, the soul, and the world in the final turn. I would offer you this: let the mind be your companion, but do not let it become your master. Welcome its gifts, honor its limitations, and open yourself to the depths from which all true knowing springs. Allow yourself to be undone and remade by the mystery that lives within and around you. This is the great adventure, the alchemy of becoming whole, the answer that cannot be spoken but only lived